Modern feminism sucks, and it does not surprise me at all that the majority of Gen Z men now class themselves as being against feminism. And in this video, I'm going to explain why from the perspective of a Gen Z man myself. But before I get into this, I also want to preface this video. And I want to make this clear that this is not an anti-female, anti-woman rant. This is a video criticising the ideology, the socio-political ideology of feminism. And the fact that I feel the need to preface this video with that, or kiss the ring, as it might be said, is exactly why feminism needs to be criticised and exactly why contemporary feminism is so problematic. So let's get started on that point. One of the biggest problems that we have with feminism today, and it seems to be a case that actually a lot of left ideologies have today, is they just believe that they're immune from criticism. They believe that they are perfect. And I don't know if this is based on a fear of being criticised, the increasing victim mentality and safe space culture that we've seen pushed through our societies. As somebody who read law from a Russell Group uni in the UK, I've seen this firsthand myself, how academics push a particular political ideology on people. It is a very real thing. It's not a right-wing conspiracy, as a lot of lefties like to make out. It genuinely is a very real thing. I went through it myself. During my law degree, we had an entire module added into the course that was entirely focused on critical gender theory. It was utterly irrelevant to the degree we were doing. It contributed in almost no way to us getting a qualifying law degree. It was entirely because some academics at Leeds University Law School wanted to push a critical gender theory on the students. So this is a thing. But with those groups of people, they seem to think that their ideologies are immune from criticism. And it's a very defining characteristic of wokeism, a form of left-wing politics that we see today that isn't really about uniting against inequality as the left was traditionally meant to be about. It's more about polarising and dividing people up into victimised groups and trying to control others by restricting their ability to criticise and talk about things, and a whole load of other issues in terms of like encouraging people to be self-loathing and feel guilty. And it's no surprise really statistically that many woke people show higher rates of depression, poor self-esteem. If you look at the research that Jonathan Haidt has spoken about around this, you know, it's deemed as controversial. It doesn't surprise me at all. Spend time around woke people at university. They are fucking miserable, self-loathing people, and they want everybody else to be as a result. But the point that I'm making with this, although it might seem like a tangent, is I think this is one of the problems that we have with contemporary feminism, is it has bought into wokeism as an ideology, this overly sensitive, authoritarian, sanctimonious form of virtue signalling that is more concerned with people posturing their own moral superiority and compensating for their self-loathing than it is actually about helping people. But the main way that they do this, and the main reason that I despise it so much, and one of the main reasons that I despise contemporary feminism so much, is the way that they go about this. And it relates to the point that I made at the beginning about how I had to preface this video about it not being anti-women. Because the main strategy that contemporary feminism uses is bigoteering as a means of controlling people and stopping criticism. There is this deliberate fusion of misogyny and intellectual criticism of the ideology. It's very much the same way that people deliberately conflate philosophical and theological criticism of Islam as being Islamophobic, right? It's the same way that people will say that if you criticise movements like BLM, then you are obviously anti-black people, when you so clearly are not. You can have a problem with the institution itself and the ideology that is being espoused. But with feminism in particular, it is always the same thing. It is always the point that if you dare to criticise feminism, you are a misogynist, you are sexist, you are an incel, you hate women. And it's just such a, I shouldn't use the word toxic, but it is a toxic way to be more fitting of talking about things. It's really reductive in the form of logical reasoning, incredibly manipulative, and it's part of the reason that so many people are afraid to criticise these ideologies, because they easily get shut down with it. And it sucks so much because most men are not misogynists. Most Gen Z men who are rejecting feminism, they're not misogynists. They don't dislike women. They don't have this inherent hatred for women. What they don't like is the way that feminism, as a socio-political movement, which, by the way, has so many different definitions and groups within it, and this is a whole part of the debate itself, but let's just look at it in terms of like the general feminist movement in the wave that we have today, post-Me Too. It's the way that they go about things and the way that they persistently stigmatise men, and that is what a lot of men don't like, and that's what I'm going to move on to as the second point here. So it may sound rich, but this genuinely is my experience of things, having gone through the university education system myself, having worked in the professional environment, having grown up in the Me Too and post-Me Too world around plenty of women who buy into contemporary feminism as their ideology. I genuinely believe that more women today are I'm trying to think of the full word, are buying into misandry, misandristic, perhaps that's the word, are male hating than there are men who are female hating. And that doesn't mean that this group of like incel, red pill, female hating guys don't exist. They do, and those guys need to get a fucking grip as well. But the difference is that one of those groups is persistently legitimised in their hatred of the other sex. One of those groups, they get away with it. They're allowed to say it. Who do you think it is? Of course, it's the feminists. And I can give you micro examples of this. The number of times that I've been in conversations around women where they openly say things like, men are trash, men suck. Wouldn't the world be a better place without men? Right? Now, say it about women. How would it be treated? Say it about black people, and how would it be treated? Why is it any different that men are allowed to be spoken about in that way? And I think that the reason that this culture is legitimised is partly because of popular culture that we've had as well. And there are some very obvious examples of this man bashing that have happened. The most prominent of these being the concept of toxic masculinity, which in itself is just a horrendous term used to stigmatise the innate universal quality of masculinity, one of the two balancing forces of the universe, masculinity and femininity, which, by the way, are both equally as important and beautiful. And it's important that we have that balance of the two of them. And neither of them should be stigmatised. There isn't toxic masculinity, there isn't toxic femininity. But this idea has been repeatedly pushed that men and their innate quality of being masculine is dangerous. And we try to drill it out of boys from a young age at school through programmes that have been measured to watch out for signs of toxic masculinity. The most obvious example of this in popular culture, though, was that awful Gillette advert a few years ago, which rightly so had an enormous backlash for the message that it was pushing, where it was buying into the narrative at the time that Me Too was persistently pushing, ideas of the so-called rape culture, as they put it, which, by the way, is a moral panic and also total fucking bollocks. And again, just the most stigmatic, awful idea to push this idea that society as a whole and the majority of men are complicit in one of the most heinous acts of evil that people can commit, right? And just founded on utterly bullshit reasoning and social scientific theory. It just was not true at all. And that doesn't downplay the existence of sexual assault and sexual offences in society. But if you do want to dig into it a little bit deeper, let's ask questions like, why is it in statutory law in England that a woman cannot rape a man? Why is it that there are much harsher sentences for the sexual offences of men than there are women? But that's another rabbit hole that we could go down. But the Gillette advert bought into this idea of rape culture and toxic masculinity and boys fighting is bad, even though men have higher rates of testosterone, have always fought, always will fought, and should not be discouraged from fighting in a controlled and safe environment because it is a legitimate channel of their masculine energy. It is not a bad thing. This idea that if you are attracted to a girl, so this next part I'm going to elaborate on because it is a bit sensitive. This idea that if you are attracted to a girl, right, when she walks past, you shouldn't do that. Bro, that's not okay, right? This deliberate conflation with the natural male instinct. Like this again, and this is the problem that the right get too much, is they think that everything is biology. The left think that everything is socialised and culture. The reality is there's a mix. But one thing that is true is that men have higher sex drives than women. It is well documented in evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. We know it to be true that the male libido is different and men are more drawn to the physical. So what this advert was doing was saying, like when men have the instinct to look, when a woman walks past, that you should repress the innate natural desire that you have as a man. And that doesn't mean you can't control yourself. It doesn't mean that you're a perv and you lech on people all the time. But for fuck's sake, man, what can you expect? Men are going to be drawn to these things. And women know this as well. We all know this, that men are more drawn to the physical. And what this advert did was it didn't get that balance right with this. It told men that they are bad for being men. The whole message of the advert was that men are bad for being men. You should be ashamed for being men. You should repress innate physical traits that you have, like having a higher libido, like having a desire to fight, right? So these are just some of the things. We could go on and on and on about the contemporary examples of man bashing in society, the double standards that exist, whether it comes to body shaming, for example, the ridiculous comments that Billie Eilish made about men not getting criticism for their body and it only being women, even though it's so blatant that men persistently get bashed for not being tall enough. They're concerned about the size of their phallus. They're concerned about receding hairlines, etc. And it, again, doesn't mean that women don't face these problems. They both do. But come on, right? Which one happens more publicly in society and is legitimised? Man bashing. Now, why do I think this happens? This is the next point that I want to make. I think people fundamentally just don't understand the experience of what it's like to be a male in today's society, because the contemporary social narrative that we have grown up with is that we still live in the 1950s. We still live in a patriarchal society where women did not have the same rights and equalities as men. And don't get me wrong, there are still inequalities that women face. For example, we should address the fact that women don't get paid leave whilst it's their time of the month. I really think that they should be allowed that. It's something that men can't empathise with, the pain that a woman has to go through every month on that. And they should get paid leave as far as I'm concerned for that. That is just one example of things. But there are actually so many inequalities today that men face now the other way, because the pendulum has swung and people don't want to admit that. And this is where Richard Reeves talks about this a lot. If you want to look at his TED Talks, go on YouTube. If you want to read his book of Boys and Men, fantastic read. He's a policy wonk. He's incredibly neutral and academic to the point. He's not like this, where it's a lot more like emotionally sensed and performative in the way that he talks about things, right? It is matter of fact, to the point, talking straight about male inequality. And men face so many inequalities today and people just don't fucking realise it. And when they do finally recognise it, when they are shown these inequalities statistically, for example, the lack of achievement in the education system, men dropping out, the fact that, for example, in the UK, actually now women out-earn men. For example, child custody rights, sentencing, male mental health care, right? All these things, when they do finally recognise these problems and inequalities that men face, it always ends up being pinned back on men as their fault. It is the fault of men that this has happened in the first place. Everything comes back to demonising men. It's their own self-inflicted problem. It's a result of their own toxicity, and therefore we should just leave men to solve it. It's their problem. You hear women saying this, oh, we're tired of hearing you complaining about things. We're tired of hearing you complain about the problems you've inflicted in yourself. The average man has not built this society. The average man today who has grown up in a working class environment is not part of the privileged elite who run society, right? And when they talk about this, to compare things, another example, they talk about this elite as a prime example of why society today is still patriarchal. Because the majority of billionaires are men, not women. Like that is the biggest fucking problem that we have today. Really? When we've got men dying at alarmingly high rates because mental health care is systemically biased against men and not in a malicious way as a byproduct of how it's been built, it doesn't work in men's favour because we treat men in mental health care like deficient women, right? It is one of the key reasons why it's not working. Another key reason, because so many men now, as we move into a post-industrial and modernised world, don't have access to the traditional manual jobs that they once did. So they're now unemployed, they're losing their status, they're losing the money that they had, and they feel pathetic as a result. And then you're telling them, oh no, it's just because you don't open up enough. You need to talk about your feelings more. No, that's not the case. And I can personally vouch for this as a man who went through 7 years of depression and had to deal with mental health care in the UK. Nothing worked for me. None of the therapy worked for me. But then I started building a business and doing things online and building communities and connecting with men. And I found my purpose and solution in helping men to do the same thing. And I've seen firsthand that that has much more effect on helping guys. If you look at the report from the APPG, the all-party political group in Britain, into male suicide and what the causes are and the solutions, the majority of guys who died by suicide, they've had frontline help, they'd reached out, they'd spoken to people. But this narrative still gets pushed that it's because men just aren't opening up enough. They need to be vulnerable. They need to be loved more. AKA, you are not operating like women. And if you were just more like women, then you wouldn't be struggling. And this is a reflection of where we're at in society today. And it is feminism that is hugely responsible for that, because feminism rightly came about to address the inequalities that women faced throughout the past. I have no issue. I have admiration, in fact, for the women's suffrage movement. I have admiration for the waves of feminism that came in the 20th century, whether that is bell hooks or Feynman, right? Some of the greatest thinkers that we have, I have the utmost respect for what they did. But today, the kind of feminism that we have is so far from that. And it is not dealing with the same sort of problems. And that doesn't mean that feminism shouldn't exist and doesn't adapt. But it's so out of touch with the reality of today's world. But people just don't want to admit it. They don't want to recognise the inequalities that men face. They don't want to recognise the way that feminism often today is used as a justification for people to behave in a sexist and stigmatising way towards young men. And this is why young men are rejecting it. Because I can guarantee you, if you speak to the average young man, particularly who's been through university, what are your experiences of dealing with feminism? They will tell you, hate, being told that I am a privileged, entitled white man, that I'm an evil person, that I am part of the rape culture, whatever it is. To give you a personal example of this, I remember having a drink thrown at me at Prees for daring to criticise feminism. I've lost count of the number of times that I've debated with feminists, and they've screamed in my face, behaved in a way that if a man did that, what would happen? Another man would fucking jump in and immediately be on guard to protect the woman, right? Because it wouldn't be acceptable. But for some reason, feminists today, particularly young feminists, they seem to think that they can behave in this awful, aggressive, narcissistic way towards men with no repercussion. And they don't get held accountable for it. And this is very much something that has been sped up by Me Too. And Me Too did address some of the problems, rightly, that there were. And again, if you speak to a lot of women. It is concerning how many of them have faced sexual offences. But the counter to this, which feminists hate, they always try and drag it down, not all men. It is the case, not all men. The vast majority of offenders are a tiny, tiny fraction of society who commit the majority offences. You cannot hold an entire gender accountable for the actions of those people. Because if we do that, then we have to start holding entire races accountable for the actions of people who belong to that race. We have to hold entire religious groups accountable. We have to hold entire sexualities accountable. Can you see the lack of logic behind this and the danger that comes with it? It is not helpful for our society. Feminism in the present day, to summarise, is so far from what it's meant to be about. It's meant to be about addressing inequality. It's meant to be about supporting gender equality. Unless, of course, you're a male exclusionary feminist, in which case you're probably just a male hater who has had a bad experience with a man and is now looking for some justification for it. But, you know, they are a minority, although they might be pretty vocal on TikTok. But real feminism, or so it's supposed to be, according to a lot of the traditional definitions, is meant to be about gender equality and bringing about equality where necessary. So why is feminism today so fucking against bringing about equality and instead more focused on clinging on to a society that we no longer live in and demonising and stigmatising young men for their inherent male qualities? It is a huge downside of this problem, and as a final point, it is arguably the primary reason why so many men have moved towards these red pill, right groups, the bold man, because the left has created this vacuum. The left has neglected men. It has failed them, and it continues to do so. And when you have another group who are saying, actually, no, you're not bad for being a man, actually do this, we're going to support you, who do you think somebody is going to go towards? The one who welcomes them in and tells them to embrace their qualities, and then a load of other shit that I don't buy into. But who do you think is going to be listened to more? It's quite fucking obvious, isn't it? And this is why modern feminism sucks.